Believe it or not, quitting your job can sometimes prevent you from bringing a legal claim against your employer, but not always. Sometimes you can quit your job and still bring a legal claim against your employer. And in those scenarios, you should seriously consider quitting your job. I'll explain everything coming up. As always, before I begin, nothing in this video is legal advice. Always talk to a lawyer about your specific situation to get legal advice. Okay, before we talk about the reasons to quit your job, let's briefly talk about the law around quitting your job and why it is so important. Believe it or not, in many situations, quitting your job will actually block your ability to bring a legal claim against your employer. And the reason for that is that most employment claims require a termination. So they require your employer to actually fire you before you can bring a legal claim. For example, suing your employer for wrongful termination. As the name suggests, wrongful termination requires a termination. So if you quit your job, you technically were not terminated and you cannot bring a claim of wrongful termination most of the time. But there is a big exception to the termination rule in employment claims, and that is called constructive discharge. So let's talk about that now. Constructive discharge is just a legal way of saying that you had no choice but to quit your job. And when you have no choice but to quit, courts view that as though you were fired. And that's what a constructive discharge is. It's when your employer makes your working conditions intolerable, forcing you to resign. But the problem with claiming constructive discharge is that it's very difficult to prove. Luckily, there are a few scenarios that courts have agreed can constitute a constructive discharge. In other words, in these situations, quitting your job is just as good as getting fired, and you can still bring a legal claim even if you quit. So let's go over my top 3 situations now. The first scenario is ongoing harassment based on your protected characteristics that your employer refuses to do anything about. Now that was a mouthful, so let me break it down a little for you. The scenario I'm talking about requires 3 things. First, importantly, this isn't just any kind of harassment. We are talking about being harassed because of your protected characteristics, like your gender, your race, your disability status, or your age over 40, just to name a few. Second, you have to have reported the harassment to your employer and given them an opportunity to remedy the situation. And third, the employer has to have refused to remedy the situation. This situation is called a hostile work environment. To learn more about hostile work environment claims, make sure to watch my video about hostile work environment. I go much more in depth into hostile work environment in that video. I'll leave a link in the description. But essentially, no one should have to endure a hostile work environment. So if you are being harassed because of your protected characteristics and you inform your employer about the harassment and your employer refuses to help you, well, you should seriously consider quitting. Quitting in a situation like that is like being forced out. And make sure to talk to a lawyer. The second situation where you should consider quitting is when your employer is refusing to pay you for work you performed. These situations give rise to wage claims, and they happen a lot. Usually it involves an employer refusing to pay workers for overtime when they work more than 40 hours in a week, or for not giving rest or meal breaks. Whatever the case may be, your employer must pay you for the work you perform. If you aren't getting paid and your employer refuses to pay you after you tell them they aren't paying you, that's called wage theft. And you can't be expected to continue working for this employer who isn't paying you for work you perform. So you should consider quitting. Let me give you an example. Say a non-exempt worker is working 50 hours per week and they notice on their pay stubs their employer is paying their regular rate for those extra 10 hours per week. So the worker reports it to the employer and tells the employer that they need to pay their overtime rate for those extra 10 hours. And the employer refuses. Well, in that situation, the worker should seriously consider quitting and contacting a lawyer. However, importantly for these kinds of claims, not everyone is entitled to overtime. To learn more about overtime rules, watch my video on overtime. I'll put a link to that one in the description too. Okay, on to the next one. My final situation where you should consider quitting is when your employer isn't following safety guidelines, putting you in harm's way, and refusing to fix the problem. Now, when I say safety guidelines, I mean those guidelines that create safety standards for dangerous jobs like construction work. Things like OSHA or state-specific versions of OSHA. Most states have their own. If you have a dangerous job and your employer isn't following these safety guidelines, your employer is risking your life, and you can't be expected to continue working under those conditions. And importantly, like all the situations I've talked about today, you have to give your employer an opportunity to remedy the situation. So just make sure to report the unsafe conditions to your employer and to whatever agency created the guidelines. And if your employer doesn't fix it after you report it, you should consider quitting your job and call a lawyer. So there you have it. If you're being harassed at work because of your protected characteristics, your employer is refusing to pay you wages for work you performed, or your employer is making your working conditions unsafe or hazardous, you should report it. And if your employer doesn't fix the situation, you should consider quitting your job and contacting a lawyer. Remember, you have the right to be safe at work and to get paid for the work you perform. If you like this video, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. I make videos about the laws that protect workers. That's all for me this week. See you next time.